Welcome to Beyond the Rings. Tonight we're going somewhere most Tolkien content creators avoid, and I think I know why. It's a region with no named protagonist, no relic, no line of kings, nothing you can put on a wiki info box and call it a day. We're going to Ered Gorgoroth, the Mountains of Terror, and the black valley that slouches beneath them, Nan Dungortheb. If you've read your Silmarillion once, you know it as the place Beren and Luthien nearly died, crossing on their way south. If you've read your history of Middle-earth, you know it's a lot stranger and a lot older than that one appearance suggests, and that Tolkien himself never quite settled what it actually was. That's the video. Not what happened there, but what is that place, ontologically speaking, and why the answer keeps slipping out of his hands every time he tries to pin it down across 4 decades of drafts. One more piece of throat clearing before we get into it, because I think it's genuinely relevant context and not just trivia. Ered Gorgoroth doesn't sit in isolation. Immediately north and west of it lies Dorthonion, the highland forest that was, before the Battle of Sudden Flame, a pleasant wooded upland held by the sons of Finurfin. After that battle, once Sauron's werewolves and general corruption take hold there, it gets renamed Tar Nu Fuin, the forest under Nightshade, and that name is doing something interesting because it's essentially reclaiming the exact Nightshade branding the earliest drafts once used for Ered Gorgoroth itself back in the Lost Tales period. It's as if Tolkien, having moved the Nightshade name off the mountains and onto the more theologically loaded Gorgoroth, needed somewhere for the old folkloric horror name to live, and gave it to the neighboring forest once that forest earned it through Sauron's corruption. Geography and nomenclature are doing genuine narrative work here, quietly, in the background, for readers who bother to track it across 2 different books written decades apart. And before anyone in the comments does the thing where they bring up Peter Jackson's spiders, no, we are not doing Shelob in Return of the King as our reference point tonight. And honestly, that's part of the problem with how this region gets treated in popular culture generally. Jackson's Shelob sequence, as fun as it is on a purely visceral level, plays entirely as a monster movie beat. Big spider, scary tunnel, hero nearly dies, hero wins. That's a perfectly serviceable action set piece, but it strips out every ounce of the cosmological weight the source material assigns to that entire bloodline. Shelob isn't just a big spider Tolkien invented for tension. She's explicitly the last child of Ungoliant's brood, the tail end of a lineage whose origin the author himself couldn't fully explain, still lurking in the roots of the world thousands of years after her mother supposedly vanished into the void, devouring herself out of hunger somewhere no text ever follows her to. Rings of Power, for its part, hasn't touched Ered Gorgoroth at all, which I'd almost respect as restraint if I thought it was a deliberate choice rather than the writers simply not knowing the region exists. Anyway, let's start with the geography, because you need the map in your head before the theology makes sense. Ered Gorgoroth sits on the northern rim of Doriath, a wall of mountains running roughly east to west, and on their southern slopes, tucked into the ravine between the mountains and the northern march of Melian's Girdle, is Nan Dungortheb, the Valley of Dreadful Death. It is, by the text's own account, one of the worst places in Beleriand to be a living creature, worse in some ways than the gates of Angband itself, which if you sit with that for a second should strike you as insane. Angband is Morgoth's fortress, the literal industrial capital of evil in the First Age, and yet the Silmarillion treats this comparatively obscure mountain valley as a horror in its own separate category. That's not an accident of prose. That's Tolkien telling you something about how evil actually works in his cosmology, and most adaptations, I'm looking at you, every Rings of Power writer's room that's never so much as gestured at this region, completely miss it. So here's premise 1, and it's the one that reframes everything else. Ered Gorgoroth is not Morgoth's territory, it's squatters' territory. This distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. When Ungoliant fled south after Formenos, after she and Melkor murdered the 2 trees, and she'd gorged herself on their light until she was bloated past sanity, she didn't retreat to Angband with her partner in crime. She went the opposite direction, into the mountains above Doriath, and she made her own nest there, on her own initiative, answering to nobody. The Silmarillion is explicit that Morgoth was afraid of her by that point, genuinely afraid. This is the Dark Lord of Middle-earth cowering from something he can't fully control, and that fear is the tell. If Ered Gorgoroth's horror was simply an extension of Angband's authority, a garrison outpost of evil, Morgoth would have folded it into his command structure. He doesn't. He can't. Ungoliant's darkness there is parasitic on the region, not administered by anyone. And this is where it gets genuinely interesting from a cosmological standpoint, because Tolkien's entire theological architecture in the Ainulindalë runs on a specific premise. Everything that exists, Eru made the possibility for, and even Melkor's discord is ultimately a thread Eru can weave back into the larger music, however painfully. Morgoth's evil, monstrous as it is at least legible within that system. Its corruption, its discord, its valor twisting something that was originally good. Orcs are ruined elves. Trolls are a mockery of Ents. Dragons are Morgoth's own art, however monstrous. Every major evil in the Legendarium traces back, however indirectly, to something that was made and then corrupted. Ungoliant does not fit that pattern, and Tolkien knew it didn't fit, because he spends real page count in the Myths Transformed essays in Morgoth's Ring, that's Home Volume 10, for those keeping score, actually wrestling with what she is. Is she a fallen Maya? Is she something that predates the Valar's arrival in Arda entirely? Some kind of primordial hunger that was never anyone's to author? He tries on a few explanations and never fully commits to one. That's not sloppy world building. That's an author staring at a hole in his own Theodicy and deciding, apparently, to leave the hole there. Which brings us to what I think is the single most underrated implication in all of this. Ered Gorgoroth is proof that Arda Marad contains evils that are not extensions of Melkor's will. That's a much bigger deal than it sounds like when you say it fast. The entire moral logic of the Silmarillion depends on evil being traceable, on there being a villain you can point to, a discordant note in the music whose source is identifiable, even when its consequences spiral out of control. Ungoliant's brood, the giant spiders infesting those mountains, ancestors, eventually, of Shelob herself down in the Third Age, represent an evil that even Morgoth regards as alien, dangerous, and not his to command. If you want to get uncomfortable about it, Era's music contained discord that isn't even Melkor's discord. Whatever Ungoliant actually is, and Tolkien genuinely never lands the plane on this, she's evidence that the moral clarity of one bad guy causes all the badness was never quite as tidy as the Silmarillion's surface narrative wants you to believe. Now, sit with that darkness for a second, because we need to talk about what happens when it runs into something completely different in character, right at the southern edge of the mountains. This is premise 2, and it's about Nan Dungortheb specifically, the valley itself rather than the peaks above it. Here's the thing that I think gets skipped past too fast in most readings. Nan Dungortheb sits at a literal border between two active magics that have nothing to do with each other and are not designed to coexist. On one side, you've got Melian's Girdle, the protective enchantment a Maya laid around the kingdom of Doriath, keyed specifically to ward off servants of Morgoth, to confuse and turn back anyone with ill intent toward Thingol's realm. That's a very particular, very intentional kind of power. Melian is a Maya of Yavanna and Esther's household by some accounts, deeply attuned to growing things and to peace, and her girdle reads almost like a spell of exclusion woven from care. On the other side of that border, bleeding down out of the mountains, you've got the residual unlight of Ungoliant's brood. Not corrupted light, not darkness in the ordinary sense, but literally light's absence, given a kind of hunger, an appetite void that consumes rather than merely obscures. It's worth pausing on what Melian's girdle actually was before it gets reduced to magic fence in casual conversation, because the contrast is the entire point. Melian raised it after the Battle of Sudden Flame. after Beleriand's northern defenses had been shattered, and it became clear Thingol's kingdom needed protection nothing mortal or even ordinary elvish craft could provide. It's not a wall in any physical sense, it's closer to a standing act of will, a Maya continuously projecting a field of confusion and dread, specifically calibrated to turn back anyone loyal to Morgoth, while leaving those without such allegiance essentially unaffected. That's a precision instrument. It's targeted, intentional, maintained. Ungoliant's Unlight, on the other hand, isn't targeted at anything. It doesn't discriminate between friend and foe because it isn't an intelligence directing a defense. It's closer to an ambient condition, a byproduct of what her brood simply is, radiating outward the way heat radiates from a fire, whether or not anyone's standing near it. One of these is a spell, the other is closer to a weather system, and these two magics were never meant to touch. Nobody designed an interface between them. And where they do touch, in that narrow ravine of Nan Dungortheb, you get what I can only describe as a standing magical accident, not a place so much as a permanent scar where two incompatible orders of power have been grinding against each other for centuries with no buffer between them. That's why travelers who cross it report symptoms that don't map cleanly onto either side individually. Hallucination, despair that feels imposed rather than earned, a thirst that behaves more like spiritual starvation than physical dehydration. It's not that Melian's girdle is malfunctioning, and it's not that Ungoliant's spiders are simply hunting there. It's interference. Two orders of magic with completely different ontological grammars forced into proximity, producing an effect neither one would produce alone. If you want a modern analogy, and look, I know analogies to real-world physics always feel a little cheap applied to Tolkien, but bear with me. It's less like two armies fighting and more like a short circuit. The valley isn't evil in the way Angband is evil, with intent behind it. It's evil the way a live wire on a wet floor is dangerous. Nobody's out to get you. The danger is structural. This is also, frankly, why I think Beren and Lúthien's crossing of Nan Dungortheb in the Silmarillion reads so differently from every other dangerous journey in the book. Compare it to, say, Frodo and Sam in Mordor centuries later. That's danger with agency behind it, orcs patrolling, a dark lord actively searching. Nan Dungortheb has almost no agency to it in the text. Nobody's hunting Beren and Lúthien specifically. The place itself is simply lethal, ambiently, structurally, the way weather is lethal, and that's a much colder kind of horror than the bad guys are coming. The Grey Annals material collected in the War of the Jewels, Home 11, actually preserves some of the fullest surviving detail on this, more granular than what made it into the published Silmarillion. And it's worth tracking down if this kind of ambient structural horror is your thing, because Christopher Tolkien's editorial choices for the published text trimmed a fair amount of the valley's specific horrors down to a paragraph or two. Let's zoom out for a second, because I want to walk you through something that I think is genuinely one of the best case studies anywhere in the Legendarium for how Tolkien's cosmology deepened over time. And it's premise 3, the region's own name changes tell the story. If you go all the way back to the Book of Lost Tales, Home Volumes 1 and 2, the earliest layer of what would become the Legendarium, written while Tolkien was still essentially inventing the shape of his mythology from scratch, this region doesn't carry anything like the weight Gorgoroth carries later. It's closer to a fairy tale spider forest, something with a folkloric flavor, dangerous in the way a wood full of monsters in an old fairy tale is dangerous, rather than dangerous in a cosmological sense. The horror is physical, local, almost quaint by comparison to what it becomes. If you actually sit down with the Lost Tales prose describing this area, the register reads much closer to something out of a Victorian or Edwardian fairy story. Dangerous woods with monstrous spiders are a stock feature of that entire tradition, going back through George MacDonald and further. And early Tolkien is still writing squarely within that inherited furniture. There's no sense yet that crossing this forest constitutes an assault on a traveler's soul. It's a place with monsters in it, full stop. The same category of danger as a wolf in a wood in a Brothers Grimm tale. dressed in Tolkien's own invented nomenclature, but not yet carrying the metaphysical machinery the mature Legendarium would eventually bolt onto it. By the time the mature Silmarillion material solidifies, and we're talking decades of revision here, this isn't a quick rebrand. The region gets renamed with names that carry genuine theological freight. Gorgoroth itself, and this is the detail that I think most casual fans miss entirely. That's the same route that names the plateau in front of Barad-dûr in the Third Age, the ash plain you cross to reach Mount Doom in the events of the War of the Ring. Tolkien's own etymological notes, scattered through the etymologies in The Lost Road, Home 5, tie that Gor route to dread itself, not simply darkness or evil in a generic sense, but a very specific quality of existential terror. That's not a coincidence, and it's not Tolkien running out of names and recycling one. He's telling you, through language, that Ered Gorgoroth and the plateau before Sauron's tower share something at the root, something the English word dread only approximately captures. Tracking that shift from cozy if dangerous fairy tale spiderwood in the 19-teens and 20s to a region whose very name links it linguistically to the seat of the Second Age's Dark Lord decades later, is basically a compressed history of how Tolkien's whole conception of Ardamad hardened over his lifetime. Early Tolkien is still writing something closer to a folk mythology with English fairy story bones. Later Tolkien has built an entire theology of corrupted music and has started retroactively deepening his own geography to match that theology's weight. Ered Gorgoroth isn't just a place that got scarier in revision. It's a fossil record of Tolkien's own cosmology, becoming more serious, more metaphysically loaded, right there in the naming conventions if you know where to look. Okay, let's get into the part of this that I actually find most unsettling, and it's premise 4, which is about exactly why this place is uniquely, specifically dangerous to elves in a way it isn't to men in quite the same structural sense, though obviously it kills men plenty too. Most threats in Middle-earth are, when you get down to it, physical. Teeth, claws, blades, fire, the raw mechanics of violence. What the text describes happening in Nan Dungortheb is different in kind, not just degree. It's described as working on the mind and spirit directly, as despair and horror that afflict the Fëa, the soul, rather than simply threatening the hröa, the body. Here's why that distinction is so much worse for an elf than it sounds like it should be. Tolkien lays out the actual metaphysics of the Fëa-hröa relationship most fully in Laws and Customs among the Eldar, part of that same Morgoth's Ring volume. Home 10 does a lot of heavy lifting in this video, if you haven't noticed. And the short version is that for the Eldar, the bond between soul and body isn't the loose, temporary arrangement it is for mortal men. It's meant to be stable, essentially permanent, barring violence. And the Fëa's well-being is directly, causally tied to the hröa's survival in a way that makes spiritual despair a genuinely lethal condition for an elf, not a metaphor for one. This is, notably, the exact mechanism by which grief kills elves outright elsewhere in the Legendarium. An elf who despairs badly enough can simply choose to release their Fëa from their hröa, or the bond can fray past the point of holding, and death follows from something that would just be depression, tragic but survivable, in a mortal. Fëa death is a real, textually supported phenomenon for elves specifically, and if you want the cleanest example of it operating elsewhere in the Legendarium, look at Miriel Serindi, Fëanor's mother, whose death after childbirth in Valinor, in Aman itself, in the Blessed Realm, nowhere near a battlefield or a monster, is presented as her Fëa simply choosing to leave her hröa out of sheer exhaustion of spirit, with the body left behind uncorrupted, essentially preserved because nothing physical actually killed her. That single case is enough to establish that for the Eldar, spiritual exhaustion is a lethal category all its own, entirely separate from wounds or old age. Now transplant that mechanism into a valley whose entire ambient effect is manufactured, if accidentally, to produce exactly that kind of spiritual exhaustion in anyone who walks through it, and Nan Dungortheb stops looking like a spider-infested ravine and starts looking like a myrial death generator with teeth as a secondary feature. So when you put an immortal race whose entire metaphysical stability rests on that hröa bond holding into a valley whose horror is described as directly eroding spirit and mind rather than simply threatening the body, you've constructed something that is, structurally, far more existentially dangerous to elves than anything Morgoth's armies could throw at them directly. An orc raid threatens elvish bodies. Nan Dungortheb threatens the actual metaphysical architecture that makes an elf an elf. Read the Beren and Luthien crossing with that lens active, and the stakes reframe themselves. Luthien, a being with Maya blood on her mother's side, crossing that valley isn't just brave girl walks through spiderwood. It's one of the only first-age sequences where an immortal being's soul stability itself is meaningfully on the line from the environment rather than from a blade. And that ties directly into premise 5, the one I think closes the loop on everything we've talked about tonight, because it goes back to that Theodicy problem I raised earlier and refuses to let it resolve neatly. Nearly every evil creature or force in the Legendarium, when you trace its lineage far enough back, resolves into something Eru made, that Melkor or one of his servants corrupted. That's the pattern that holds the whole moral architecture of the Silmarillion together. Evil is privative, evil is corruption of a prior good. Nothing evil was created evil from the start, because Eru's music, however marred by discord, ultimately contains and will resolve every thread. It's a genuinely elegant theological system, and it's also, notably, a system Ungoliant's brood does not fit into cleanly, no matter how hard you try to force it. It's worth contrasting this with the other great unresolved origin debate in the Legendarium, because Tolkien's handling of the two cases is telling in its difference. The origin of orcs also shifts across drafts. Sometimes they're corrupted elves captured and tortured by Melkor in the deeps of time. Sometimes late notes flirt with them being bred from lesser men. Sometimes Tolkien seems to want them to be soulless constructs entirely, animated matter with no fear to speak of at all. But notice, every single one of those competing theories still keeps orcs inside the corruption framework. Whichever draft you pick, something good got twisted into something evil, and Melkor or his lieutenants did the twisting. The debate is about the mechanism of corruption, never about whether corruption happened at all. Ungoliant gets no such courtesy. Her origin is never resolved. Tolkien floats theories in those Morgoth's Ring essays. Maybe she's a fallen Maya whose original nature has been so thoroughly consumed by her own hunger that nothing recognizable remains. Maybe she predates the Valar's descent into Arda entirely, something closer to an embodiment of primordial void hunger than a corrupted spirit at all, and he never picks one. That's not an oversight in a 50-page appendix nobody read. That's the author of the entire cosmological system, visibly, deliberately unresolved on a piece of his own Theodicy, leaving open the disturbing possibility that some of the evil loose in Arda was never anyone's fault to begin with, never anyone's to corrupt, because it was never anyone's creation in the first place. Ered Gorgoroth's spiders in that reading aren't villains in the moral sense Sauron or the Balrogs are villains. They're evidence that Eru's music has a loose thread the Valar themselves would rather not tug on, because pulling it apart might mean admitting the system isn't as complete as the Ainulindale wants you to believe. I want to close on why I think this matters beyond just being a fun lore rabbit hole, because I think there's a real argument that Ered Gorgoroth is doing important structural work for the entire First Age narrative, work that's easy to miss precisely because the region gets so little screen time. Everywhere else in the Silmarillion, evil has a face, Morgoth has a face, even if it's usually off-screen, Sauron has a face, the kinslaying at Alqualonde has faces attached to it on both sides. Ered Gorgoroth is the one major horror in the entire First Age that resists that pattern completely, faceless, motiveless in any way you can hold a grudge against. structural rather than personal, a wound in the world rather than an act committed by someone you could theoretically negotiate with, defeat, or redeem. And I'd argue that's exactly why Tolkien needed it in the text at all. Without it, the First Age risks reading like a straightforward morality play. Good elves, bad Morgoth, complicated kinslaying in the middle, but ultimately a universe where evil is always traceable to a decision someone made. Ered Gorgoroth is the crack in that floor. It's Tolkien, consciously or not, admitting that even in a world literally sung into being by a benevolent creator, some of the darkness doesn't answer to anyone, corrupts nothing prior, and simply is. That's a genuinely bleak note for a Legendarium that ultimately resolves toward hope. The whole arc bends toward the music's dissonance being redeemed in the end, toward eucatastrophe, toward things working out even when they shouldn't. Ered Gorgoroth is one of the very few places in the text where Tolkien lets a shadow sit there completely unresolved, unexplained, and structurally permanent, right up through the end of the First Age, and arguably right through to the Third, since Shelob is still down there in the roots of the mountains centuries later, still uncomposed, still nobody's fault. Make of that what you will. I think it's one of the most quietly radical things buried in this entire mythology, and it's sitting in a mountain range most adaptations have never even bothered to put on a map. Sources for tonight: the Silmarillion, particularly of the flight of the Noldor and of Beleriand and its realms, along with the Beren and Luthien chapters covering the Nan Dungortheb crossing. Morgoth's Ring, Home Volume 10, both the myths transformed essays on Ungoliant's unresolved nature and laws and customs among the Eldar on the hröa bond. The War of the Jewels, Home 11, for the Grey Annals material on the Valley's fuller horrors. The Book of Lost Tales, Parts 1 and 2, Home Volumes 1 and 2, for the earliest Nightshade version of the region. And The Lost Road, Home Volume 5, for the etymologies entries tying the route to Gorgoroth proper. If you've made it this far, you already know the drill. The comments are yours, and I know at least 3 of you are going to argue with me about whether Ungoliant predates the Valar, so have at it. Until next time, this has been Beyond the Rings.